what about these, what is it, 40,000 missing registration forms?
It's actually more than 40,000. We are using the most conservative estimate. The challenge is not that the counties we think did anything untoward, but that the state of Georgia, headed by the Secretary of State, requires that every form that is completed go through a series of screens, including the Social Security Administration proof of citizenship. And the problem is that, according to experts, that proof could be a false negative almost 40% of the time, which means that you could have a 20-year-old who's a college student without an ID, without a driver's license, who submits a Social Security number and is rejected falsely, but is never told that they're rejected and is never told why. And we think that a variety of these problems, clerical errors, screenings, these have all led to more than 40,000 of our applications not being properly processed. The problem with our process is that we don't have information unless the Secretary of State gives it to us. The reason we went with a writ of mandamus, it is an extraordinary request. We went with that because we couldn't get the Secretary of State to meet with us and tell us what was happening. And so we used the legal route of the writ of mandamus. However, I do want to point out that Judge Brasher did not allow for discovery. He did not allow for an evidentiary hearing. So we were essentially being asked to prove something we suspected without being able to access the information that would give us the proof.
So last week, the county judge dismissed the lawsuit brought by your group, the New Georgia Project, and the Georgia chapter of the NAACP over the more than 40,000 voter registration records that have gone missing. Fulton County Court Judge Christopher Judge Brasher wrote the petitioners, quote, failed to allege, much less show the county's registrar's past or continued failure to process voter registration applications. The judge went on to exonerate Secretary of State Kemp, saying, quote, the petitioners have failed to come forward with evidence showing that the Secretary of State has failed to carry out this duty, or even that this duty is ripe, since it can only be carried out after the various counties' election registrars register an eligible voter. Your response to that?
I think it's a poor reading of what the law says. The law requires, and the state has set, the Secretary of State as essentially the CEO of elections. He's the chief elections officer. That means it's his job to tell the counties what to do. When the counties do that job, he sets up the screenings, the use of the Secretary of State's website, the use of the Social Security Administration, the use of the Department of Driver Services, the use of the Department of Corrections. He batch processes all of the letters that say that there are deficiencies. He batch processes all of the precinct cards. The Secretary of State is actually the head of elections. The counties are essentially franchisees that get information from the Secretary of State or have to follow the Secretary of State's orders. And the problem we have with the judge's response was that what he said is, well, out of 6 million, 40,000 is not substantial noncompliance, and so we're not going to hold him accountable. But worse, what he said is that the remedy for not being registered to vote is to cast a provisional ballot, which in the state of Georgia can be akin to not being able to cast a ballot at all. So essentially, there is no do-over. Our issue is that the Secretary of State is in charge of elections, and to put the responsibility on counties that have to follow his directions, use his systems, and abide by his rulings, and then to say that he's not responsible is a very poor reading of state law, but even worse is a poor reading of our system of voting.
I mean, this is a big moment in Georgia. And what's happened in Georgia, of course, is that you've had more and more blacks move back. You had more and more Latinos move in, actually come in from Mexico over the years, established families. And you have more and more swing voter white women who say, you know what, I would prefer to vote as Republican, but they've lost their mind when it comes to my rights, and I'm going to go with none. And so there's a real concern. And what is terrifying about Georgia is you see how a man who could be a good man on most days, Mr. Kemp, can get worried in a very public way about the impact of these changes in who's voting in Georgia, and how it could impact his party, and then very publicly appear to be dragging his feet. The allegations that he made are so ridiculous. It's just like hard to comprehend. Georgia's law says as soon as ink goes on to a voter reg form, it has to be turned in. So if I hand you a form at your door and you write down Mickey Mouse, I got to hand it in. When you have a law like that, up to 10% of the forms can be impacted. Out of 86,000, he's been able to find maybe 50. So, if it was above, say, 8,600, we would be concerned because it's their own law that requires you to turn in these problematic forms. they've done such a great job when there could have been 86,000, there's 50.
Is Georgia the next Florida?
Georgia could be. I mean, you have these real dynamics. Nunn and Carter are big names in Georgia. They are attracting a lot of folks to vote who may not have voted before and certainly may not have voted for a Democrat in a very long time. And on top of that, Stacey has been leading what is the largest voter reg drive we have seen in decades. It's not just the 86,000 her group has done. It's like about 50,000 more that they funded other groups to do. It's about 130,000 new voters coming on to the rolls. But as Stacey says, what is absolutely deeply concerning and should be for the entire civil rights community and really anybody who cares about voting is all of these encumbrances. The fact that you could have a 40% error rate in this cross-match. Think about, I used to be a reporter in Jackson, Mississippi. I can't tell you how many men I met named Willie Williams or Johnny Johnson, and they're going to cross-check every Willie Williams and every Johnny Johnson in the South. I mean, it's a mess. And then you go back and say, well, who created this interstate, check system? And it's Chris Kobach, who is like the most inflammatory Secretary of State in the country. And now you have people like Kemp, who again, for a long time seemed like a reasonable guy, but has become increasingly partisan. Signing up from him, with Chris Kobach's crazy scheme and not telling folks in the Georgia Senate or Assembly, it's deeply troubling.